Well, welcome everybody to this latest edition of the Future So Right podcast. I'm your host, Pete Beal, and as always, this is a Green Flame Press production. So we actually managed to get this done. If you tuned in to our last episode, you would know that this release was a little bit in question due to some plans that I had that threatened to interfere. But if you're hearing this, obviously that means I was able to get the episode done on time and on schedule, and I hope you enjoy. As always, I'd like to extend my sincerest thanks to everybody who tuned in to the last episode. I hope you enjoyed our miscellaneous episode. If you liked that format, let me know via the website, via the comments down below what you thought of it. You can always leave feedback on my website, petebeal.com. It is linked in the description below. You can also ask questions, submit topic suggestions, contact with me in any way you wish. There's also a form if you're interested in becoming a guest on this podcast. We'd love to have you. Just fill it out and it will notify me, and I'll get in touch with you as soon as possible, and we'll get you on the podcast. You can talk about anything you want. So without further ado, I think we're going to dive right in today. We actually have a set topic for the show today. Today we're going to be talking about publishing. And specifically we're going to be talking about self-publishing versus traditional publishing. We're going to discuss some pros and cons of each option. This is one of those decisions that authors have to face when they're going through the process. And it's one where there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of conflicting information out there. So I thought we would sort of cut through some of that baloney and hopefully provide some useful information. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Thank you. So I figured the best thing that we might want to do now is answer a common question. If I want to get rich and famous as an author, am I better off traditional publishing or self-publishing? Here's my answer to that. I want you to walk out of your house, walk into the nearest field you can find, and I want you to stand there. And I want you to wait there until you get struck by lightning. Now you might be saying this is ridiculous. Well, the truth is that you have about as much of a chance of walking out into that field and getting struck by lightning as you do of becoming rich and famous, either traditional or self-publishing. Now, I don't say this to discourage anyone, but the fact is that there are quite a few people who get into this business not because they love the work, not because they want to express their creativity, but because they look at an author like, say, J.K. Rowling, and they think, well, maybe this is my way to become successful in a quick and easy way. It is not. I will repeat, you have better chances of getting struck by lightning. You have better chances of winning the lottery. You have to come into this line of work because you enjoy doing it. This has to be something that you would sit down and do even if there was no possibility at all that you would get paid for it. And here's the thing, if you write a book solely for the purpose of making money and you put it out there, it's going to come across in your work. One way or another, people are going to realize it. Okay, so now that we got that little spiel out of the way, let's dive into some more realistic and truthful pros and cons of traditional and self-publishing. I thought we would go ahead and start by talking a little bit about traditional publishing, aka publishing through a publishing house. Let's start with the most obvious pro to doing this. And that is if the publisher accepts your manuscript and elects to publish your book, in all likelihood you are going to receive what's called an advance. So what is an advance? An advance is essentially guaranteed money. It's essentially stating that they are expecting you to make them a certain amount of profit, and they're paying you in advance for that. Now, to be clear, this advance is based on the royalty that you agree to with the publisher when you sign your contract. So, you will not begin to earn any royalties on sales of that book until you earn out your advance. Now, for a first-time author, you're probably not going to get much of an advance. This can vary a lot. From what I've found, the average seems to be anywhere from $2,500 to $10,000. If you're really lucky, you might get more. But while this is not necessarily the best money in the world, it is guaranteed money. So even if your book never sells a single copy, you've made that money off of it. Now, obviously, if you are successful and you sell a lot of books for them, you can renegotiate each time you publish a new book. I want a higher advance now, I want a higher advance now, and most of the time they're going to accept that as long as your sales justify it. But as a first-time author, you are not going to receive a six-figure advance unless you are, say, a celebrity or someone of that type of stature. It's just not going to happen. So while you may look at those amounts and think, oh, a $2,500 advance, a $5,000 advance, well, that's nothing considering the 2 or 3 years I spent working on this book. And you're right, if you're talking about the amount you're getting paid, say, per hour, it's very bad. It's true. But you have to understand that publishing a book, both from an author's point of view and from a publishing house's point of view, is a bit of a gamble. And so while it's bad money, guaranteed bad money, right? So let's dive into another pro of traditional publishing. And this is one that can be quite appealing, especially if you're new to the industry and you're not really familiar with it, and all you really want to focus on is writing your books. When you write a book, that's not what goes out for publication, right? There's a lot more that goes into it than that. A cover needs to be designed. The book needs to be edited. The book needs to be proofread. The book needs to be set up to be printed on the page. When you open a book, open the nearest book that you have now, you'll see that each page is designed in the same manner. The margins on the side of the page are the same. You have the page numbers, the chapter headings. All of this has to be done manually, right? It needs to be formatted in this way. These are things that you might not necessarily know how to do. I would say it's highly unlikely that there's many authors out there who are very familiar with every one of these processes. So, you can learn how to get all of this done yourself and pay to have all of this done yourself, because let's be honest, it's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to write your book, create a cover for your book, format your book, edit your book, proofread your book. All of these are things that require experience, they require a certain amount of training. And the great thing about traditional publishing is that the publishing houses have people on staff that know how to do these things. And so when you send in your manuscript, most of what you're going to be doing from that point is working with their editor to fine-tune your story to get it ready for publication. You're not going to be worried about your cover art. They either have artists on staff or they have artists they contract with who are going to take care of that, and they're going to pay for it. You don't have to worry about getting it set up for print. They have people that are going to do that, and the publishing house is going to pay for it. Proofread the final copy to make sure there are no errors. They have people that are going to do that. So you see, there are obvious advantages in terms of the amount of work that you personally are going to have to do with traditional publishing, right? If you think that you can do all of these things on your own, one, I would question the truthfulness that you are having with yourself. But if you are being honest with yourself, and this is the case, then yeah, maybe traditional publishing might not be the best avenue for you. But if you're someone who's looking for more help, you just want your focus to be on the writing, traditional publishing could be a potentially great option for you because they're going to take care of all of those little details that you probably realistically know very little about. There's one more significant pro that I want to talk about in regards to traditional publishing, and that's in regards to distribution. Now, as a self-published author, the majority of your sales are most likely to come from online sales. So if you're hoping to, say, be able to walk into a Barnes & Noble, especially, say, you were to travel to a town on the other side of the country and walk into a Barnes & Noble and see your book, it's not impossible that that would be the case, but it's rather unlikely. The traditional publishers have contacts with all of the major book distributors. And what this means, simply put, is that they get your book into the bookstores. Now, depending on what your book is and how they feel it's going to perform, this isn't necessarily guaranteed, but they certainly have the ability to do this. If they feel your book might be a big success on a certain display, for example, they might indeed pony up the money to get your book put on that display. These are things that you would have to figure out and negotiate for yourself if you were self-publishing, and that's not going to be a very easy thing to do. Along with that comes things like organizing, obviously, book tours. Again, they have these contacts in the bookstores, and they would pay for the expenses, things like that. So with all of that being said, I think it's time to get into a few of the cons for traditional publishing. And I'm going to start with one that's a little bit, I don't know if I would even call it a full con. And I hope you understand what I mean when I elaborate a little further. When many people make the decision to traditionally publish, there's one motivating factor that's often common in these people's thought process. And it's one that I think is quite common in a lot of authors' thought process. And that's simply put, I don't mind writing my books, but I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and market them. So I'll go with a traditional publisher, and they will do the marketing for me. That's a great thought. You can cling to that dream all you want, but that's not how it's going to work. You have to understand that these big publishing houses are a business, and they're out trying to make profit like everybody else, and they have budgets, and their marketing budgets are most likely a lot smaller than you think they are. So what are they going to devote those marketing budgets to? Are they going to devote their marketing budget to the first-time author with it's a good book but nobody knows who they are? That's probably not going to happen, is it? Their big marketing budgets are going to be spent on the authors who are proven moneymakers. Think people like Stephen King is going to get a big marketing budget. James Patterson is going to get a big marketing budget. And I know what you're thinking, well, they're already big. Why do they need a big marketing budget? People are going to buy their books anyway. I don't make the rules, but that's just how it tends to go. So, if the publisher isn't making some huge effort to market your book, who's going to market your book? Well, that's right, you are. They're absolutely going to give you a little bit of guidance on how to do this. They'll probably feature your book. Publishers have, the best word I could think of is catalogs of all of their coming publications. They'll most likely feature your book in that. But most of the rest of your marketing is going to fall on your shoulders. So I wouldn't necessarily call this a con of traditional publishing because honestly it's not very much different from self-publishing, but I just wanted to throw it in a little bit because it is a bit of a misconception that people have about traditional publishing. Oh, I write my first book, I send it in, and they sell it. That is a fairy tale. You are living in a fairy tale. I'm sorry. It's true. So this isn't to say that you shouldn't traditionally publish. I'm just saying that if marketing is your main motivation for doing so, you may want to reevaluate what all of your motivations are. One small last point I would like to make on this is simply put, you could try to say, well, I'm still not going to market my book. I'm traditionally published and they should be doing that for me. You could go that route and let me know how that works out for you when you write a second book and you want them to publish it. Just something to think about. One of the cons of traditional publishing sort of ties into one of the pros that we discussed earlier, actually. You might recall we were talking a bit about how if you don't have experience with cover design and formatting, etc., the publisher will handle those for you. Now, this can be a great thing, but from an author's standpoint, it might not always necessarily be a great thing. And here's what I mean by that. When the publisher is the one paying the bills, the publisher is the one making the final decisions. Now, they might ask you your opinion on some things, but ultimately, it's up to them. If you don't like the cover, but they feel the cover is what's going to get them the most sales, they're going to go with that cover. If you disagree with your editor about a certain point in the story, but they are bound and determined that that's the way it has to be, then that's the way it's going to be. You almost have to think of it, well, it's not a traditional employer-employee relationship. It's, in a way, similar, right? Because they're the one making this investment, so they're going to have it their way. And ultimately, they do usually know better than you do what the right thing is. This is true. But if you're, I hesitate to use the word control freak, but it might be an accurate term here. If you're more of a control freak and you want to have final say over all of these aspects of your book, this might not be the best path to publication for you. So that's just something to take in mind, something to consider. Another con I wanted to discuss about traditional publishing has to do with the control that a publisher has over your work. And we touched on this a little bit just a minute ago, but I wanted to go at this from a different angle. So they have the right to determine how your book is distributed or not distributed. So if you think about that, it's a possibility that a publisher could decide to delist your book, right? They just decide they're not going to sell it anymore. Now, why would they do this? Well, what if they had another book from another author that's a similar book that they think might perform better, and they don't want your book in competition with it? Now, I don't think that's necessarily a common scenario, but it is a possibility. It could happen, and it has happened in the past. The more likely issue that you could run into with distribution rights, however, is the fact that publishing in this day and age is not necessarily the most secure business type. Obviously, you have your very large established publishers, and publishing through them is going to be a fairly safe route. But there's also a lot of small to mid-sized publishers that can offer great services, but they're not necessarily as secure financially, fiscally, in the long term. So what happens if you publish through one of these smaller houses, and ultimately they go out of business a few years down the road? You could run into a situation where you've sold the distribution rights to your book to a publisher that's no longer functional. And that can be tricky in terms of getting those rights back. And it can be expensive. You'd have to hire legal support and all sorts of different costs you could potentially incur to try to get your own publishing rights back. So again, not the most common situation, but it is one that I think authors should be aware of before they wade into these waters. The last con I want to talk about in regards to traditional publishing before we move on into self-publishing has to do with what I call the gatekeeping aspect. Getting published by a traditional publisher is not necessarily an easy thing to do. Even if you have a great book, it's still not necessarily an easy thing to do. So think about this. Many traditional publishers will not accept a submission from an author who does not have representation by a literary agent. Okay, so you can't even submit to a lot of publishers until you go out and first submit to agents. So you need to go out, send out letters, query letters to agents seeking representation. They may not necessarily respond to you in a timely manner. I've heard some cases where it takes 3 to 6 months to get a response back. Okay, so let's assume you get it on your first try. Maybe the agent takes 3 months to respond, they really feel great about you, and they accept. Okay, I'm going to represent you. Then comes the process of querying publishers. Again, publishers, you have to understand, could get thousands upon thousands of submissions every year. So the limited staff that they have on hand is not going to be conducive to getting to your manuscript quickly, right? Assuming they even accept a manuscript right away. They might just want a query letter. They might want a query letter plus the first few pages. And then it gets there, it sits in a pile for 6 months until they get a chance to read it. Some publishers demand that they get exclusive rights, meaning you can't submit to multiple publishers at once, and in that instance, your book is sitting there for 6 months doing nothing. And then if they decide they don't want it, you've got to move on. And their reasons for not wanting it might not have to do with the quality at all. It might just be, we don't think in this market that this is the right book for us. Okay, 6 months gone. Now we're going to submit to another publisher, and it's going to go through the waiting process again. So you can see there's certain downsides to this. Now, there are also upsides. Theoretically speaking, most of the books which go through traditional publishing should be of higher quality because of this process, right? Again, I say theoretically. Obviously, we've all seen traditionally published books that we can't stand, that we think are horrible. We've seen self-published books we think are wonderful. It's just one of those things, one of those parts of the process that if you want to be traditionally published, you're going to have to accept. It's probably going to take a long time to get done. Are you willing to put your book on a shelf for 2 or 3 years while you wait? It's a possibility you could have to. So now that we've discussed a few pros and a few cons of traditional publishing, why don't we dive into the self-publishing realm a little bit? Now, when I'm talking about self-publishing, I of course mean publishing without the aid of a traditional publisher or even a vanity publisher. Most people do this through the use of print-on-demand services such as KDP or Ingram. Other people, there are options too where you can have certain numbers of your books custom printed by specialty printers, although most people go the print-on-demand route. So what are some pros of self-publishing your work? Well, we talked earlier a little bit about how some of the cons of traditional publishing were the control that they have over certain aspects of your book, right? Well, when you self-publish, you have control of all of those aspects. The final cover design, that's you. You decide that. Your interior formatting, how that looks, you decide that. If your editor makes a suggestion that you don't like, you don't have to do it. You don't have to hire an editor at all if you don't want to. I highly recommend against going that route, but it is a certain freedom that you have. You also have the freedom to publish your book no matter what, right? So if a publisher doesn't accept your manuscript because maybe it's in a genre that's not hot right now, right? They're looking at things that they know they're going to sell well. And your book might be good, but it's just not what's trendy at the moment. So they turn it down. Well, that doesn't mean necessarily that it's a bad book. It just means it's not right for them or not right for right now for them. You could still release that. You can still put it out there in the world. So you could look at it as one of the cons of traditional publishing could be the gatekeeping aspect of it, and that simply doesn't exist for a self-publisher. Now, this could potentially lead to issues Maybe your book isn't as strong as it needs to be before going out into the world, and that's a risk that you're essentially agreeing to take. But it's a risk that you get to decide to take on your own. That's a decision that you have made. Nobody's making it for you. So when you look at it that way, there's certainly a positive aspect to self-publishing, especially to people who like to be in control of their own work. And it's understandable why someone would want to be fully in control of their own book. Think about how much time it takes to create that piece of work. Another pro of self-publishing that I'd like to dive into, or at least touch on just a little bit, has to do with royalty rates. Self-publishers, and I want to preface this by saying you can't really put all of traditional publishing under one umbrella when it comes to royalty rates. It's going to vary from publisher to publisher and even author to author, depending on the contract you signed. So this is very much a generality that I'm about to dive into. But self-publishers traditionally take home a higher royalty per book than a traditional publisher, and it makes sense when you think about it. We talked earlier about how the publisher has editors on staff to edit your book. They have cover art that they're going to buy for your book. They have formatters that are going to take care of your book. All of these people need to get paid too. Well, how are those people getting paid? They're getting paid off of sales, book sales, including your book sales. So essentially you have to look at it as the publisher is taking a cut of that royalty and using it to provide the services that you use to publish your books. Now, if you self-publish, the print-on-demand company is going to essentially charge you, so to speak, for the cost to print your book, and they're also going to take a certain percentage for their trouble. This is going to be fixed, and so you know pretty much what your royalty rate is going to be all the time. And you get a bigger slice of that. Now, obviously, there are other aspects at play here that we're going to get into a little bit in a few minutes when we get to the cons of self-publishing. But I just wanted to touch on that. If you just look at it from a straight royalty rate comparison, self-publishing royalty rates are typically going to be at least a little bit higher than those of traditionally published authors. The last pro I'm going to get into on self-publishing is really broad, but I think it really sort of encapsulates all of the pros of self-publishing sort of into one general area of conversation. And we've talked about it a little bit already, but it's just general freedom. You have the freedom to make decisions for yourself. You have the freedom to work with the editor that you want to work with. Whereas if you go through a traditional publisher, you're going to work with their editor, and they might be a great editor, but your personalities may not mesh right. You get the freedom to choose your editor, to choose your cover artist, to work with people who you want to work with. You have the freedom to release your book when you release your book. That's your decision, right? If you want to release your books 2 months apart, you have the freedom to do that. 6 months apart, that's fine. 3 years apart, I question your business acumen, but you can do that. That's your decision. If you only want to sell your book on Amazon, you can do that. If you only want to sell your book at barnesandnoble.com, that's your prerogative. You can do that. If you aren't beholden to a publisher, you can make all sorts of horrible statements on social media. And you know what? I don't agree with that. But you don't have the risk of a publisher pulling your book because of it. So it's just something to think about. Just general freedom. You essentially answer to nobody but yourself. Some people can't handle that lack of structure. I'm just going to say that outright. It might not be for you. If you're the type of person that maybe needs a little bit of supervision, maybe self-publishing isn't your path. But if you've always wanted to work for yourself, it might be a great opportunity to try it out. Now I'm going to get into some of the cons of self-publishing, and honestly, I don't expect this segment to be very long. Not because the cons don't exist, but because I think some of them are going to be pretty self-explanatory based on what we've already talked about. So for example, earlier we were talking about how traditional publishing, one of the pros would be the wide distribution, or the ability to have wide distribution for your book. Now, self-publishing, this isn't impossible to get. However, it's more work. It's more difficult. You have to do this yourself. You have to go out and forge those contacts yourself. The same thing applies to marketing your book. We talked a little bit about how it's true traditional publishers aren't going to invest a huge chunk of their marketing budget in you, but they are going to do some marketing. And now there's no marketing other than what you do for yourself if you're self-publishing. Obviously, I think it's self-explanatory enough the amount of additional work that's going to go into self-publishing. You're acting not only as an author, but essentially as the publisher yourself. So before we were talking about how the publisher would take care of your cover art, your formatting, they would provide you with an editor. All of these are now your responsibility. They're entirely on your plate. And the last thing that I would bring up is that being a self-published author is not necessarily a cheap proposition. Now it can be. It's certainly, listen, you can go out and you can publish a book for free. I don't recommend this, but you can do it. You can go out there, you can design your own cover, you don't hire an editor, you just type it up and throw it out into the world. It can be done. But if you want a professional product, it's going to cost you some money. Nobody's going to do your cover for you for free. Nobody's going to edit your book for free. If people are offering these services to you for free, you should be asking questions. Why are you offering this to me for free? Now, there's one thing, it's an idea I've had for a podcast where I discuss a little bit about the costs of self-publishing. And if this is something you're interested in hearing based on my own experiences, drop a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. If this is something you'd like to hear, maybe I'll make this episode in the near future, especially as I draw closer to my fall release date and I'll have a better idea of overall the final costs. One thing I'd like to say is that there's no right or wrong decision when it comes time to make this decision. There's just the right path and the wrong path for you. And at the end of the day, nobody knows you better than you do. Nobody knows what's important to you. Nobody knows what the best option for your book is better than you. I hope this has been somewhat helpful. It's a talk I've enjoyed having here. But honestly, if we're going to be serious here, there's no way that we could ever fit everything that we need to discuss about traditional publishing versus self-publishing into a podcast that comes out to 30 or 40 minutes in length. It was never going to happen. So I'd like to refer you to a resource, and it actually comes from a guest of the podcast a few episodes back, Katie Wall. She actually wrote a book about this very thing, how to choose the correct publishing avenue for you. That's going to be linked down below, and it is 100% free. You don't have to pay a dime. You just go down, click, and it will give you the book. All right? So feel free to check that out. I highly recommend it. It's great. It's about 20 pages, and it's outstanding. There's a lot of good information, more so than we could ever get to in a single conversation. You know, now that I mentioned that book, I'm actually going to add one last point. And it's something that Katie says in the book that I loved. I thought it was the best line of the book, and it's a very short line. And it's something that a lot of writers don't think about. Your book is a product. Now, your book's a work of art. It's an expression of yourself. But if you're going to go out there and you're going to publish this with the intent of selling it, you also need to recognize it for what it is. It is a product. And if you want people to buy this product, it is a responsibility. I don't know if it's the perfect word for this, but we're going to go with it. It's your responsibility to ensure that you've chosen the correct avenue for putting it out into the world. There's no such thing as guaranteed success in the publishing industry. There are plenty of traditionally published books that have bombed. There are plenty of self-published books that have never sold a single copy. It happens. There are no guarantees in publishing or in life. But by equipping yourself with the right information, by doing your research, you can at least choose the path that sets you up with the best chance of success. So with that, I think we're going to bring this episode of the Future So Right podcast to a close. I do hope you enjoyed the content today. If you did, scroll down, mash on that like button. I really appreciate it if you do. If you want to see more, you can always subscribe to the YouTube channel. I've got some exciting content planned for the coming months, and I hope you'd come along for the ride. As always, if you have any feedback, topic suggestion, question for the program, you can find my website, linked down below, petebeal.com. There's a form you can fill out that'll get to me. If you're interested in being a guest of the podcast, sitting down and having a little talk about writing, I would love to do that with you. petebeal.com, link down below. You can always follow me on social media as well. You might be seeing a trend here, but guess what? It's linked down below. Alright, I'm not going to waste any more of your time, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. This has been a Green Flame Press production. We'll be back with another episode in about 2 weeks. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay creative, and always keep writing. Thank you.